One of Vue's most powerful and probably most unique feature is ecosystem creation. And that's what we're going to be taking a look at now, is the ability to control those ecosystems. So the first thing I'm going to do is load in a standard terrain. And I'm also going to constrain this terrain on the z-axis and just kind of bring it down a bit, just so it's a little flatter, because I mostly want to just be looking at the distribution of things and the scaling and pretty much just controlling those aspects of this ecosystem. And because ecosystems do not generate on slopes and things like that, on the sides of mountains, this way we can make sure that it's flat enough where we're going to get a good distribution of our ecosystem throughout this terrain. So I'm just going to flatten it up a bit and move our viewport so our camera is facing downward on this terrain. And now we're going to click on the first button up here, which is going to give us our material preview. Right mouse click and go to Edit Material. Now the first thing we want to do is check Ecosystem, and if you're in the basic material editor, which looks like this, you want to click on the advanced material editor and go to Ecosystem. And we're not really going to worry about too much about our underlying material, which is just our default color, this sort of tan color, which we can still access by going to the General tab and double-clicking on underlying material. You'll also notice that volumetric material and ecosystem have been grayed out, and we can no longer select those functions. But that's because it's directly tied to our ecosystem now. So the first thing we want to do is add a plant. So we're going to add plant, and I'm going to select the Mexican palm tree and click OK. And this will work with any of the preset plants that you have, or rocks, or buildings, anything you import in, any object whatsoever. But right now I'm going to select this Mexican palm tree, and you can, of course, select something else if you want, but this is the one I'm choosing to use. And because our terrain is actually rather small right now, we're going to have to scale down our palm tree, which I'm going to bring down to about 0.2. Under density, I'm going to bring it up to 90% and click populate. Now, as you can see, we have 90% distribution of this ecosystem on our terrain. And if we want, we could bring it up to actually 100%, hit populate, and now we'll see that we can see absolutely none of the actual material underneath that. Maybe a little flecks of it here and there through the trees, but overall it's pretty much 100% coverage. And now what we want to look at is our variable density. Now we have the ability to change the denseness of either the overall ecosystem or in specific areas, and we can do this by using the function editor. If you check off variable density, it will give us the option of changing our function scale. It gives us a filter that we can use to change our actual function and the actual function itself. So we're going to right mouse click on our preview and go to Edit Function, which is going to bring up our function editor. Now within the function editor, we can use either a noise node or a fractal node to create our variable density. I'm going to be using a fractal node, which is the second button in the second group here. And now we have our fractal node linked directly to density and to position. And by default, we have a simple fractal, Perlin noises, gradient. And I want to go and make our gain a bit higher, and also up our roughness so that we get more of a change between the blacks and the whites. Because of course black is going to be the least amount of density and white is going to be the most, so from 0 to 100%. I also want to bring our wavelength down because, like I said before, we are working with a smaller terrain, so we do want to scale this down so it fits. So I'm going to bring this down to 0.25 on all of the axes and click OK. And now since we've made a change, in order for this change to take effect, we are going to have to click populate. And every time you make a change anywhere within any of these settings for an ecosystem, you are going to have to populate. Even with color, you'll have to populate. If we take a look at our terrain now, you can see that we have our variable density. So we have small bits and pieces that are not showing up with any trees whatsoever, and that's entirely linked to our function. We could, of course, change this function if we wanted to. We could make it even smaller or even bigger. The overall function just outside of this, of the actual editor, which is right here. So if we want to make it even smaller, we can go ahead and 0.5 in and hit populate, and we'll notice this much smaller texture on here. Now, because of our overall density, we're not noticing maybe as much variation as we could. So if we bring it down to about 90% and hit populate, we'll notice more change. And now we have more of a blend in between certain sections where we have kind of the gray part of the function. And then, of course, our white areas are where it's the most dense, and black where there is nothing at all. And we can control this function with just about anything at all that's available with our fractal nodes and our noise nodes. So we could change this to math patterns, and we could do onion, or we could do distributed patterns and round samples. And we could just use any of these at all to create our distribution. We could use fabric and go ahead and click OK. Maybe I'll bring down our gain just a bit and bring in some grays and click OK. And now if we repopulate, we'll notice that it's sort of a fabric pattern. And since we are using trees to create that pattern, it doesn't show up entirely as maybe you would expect if you were creating a material. But you do sort of get that look to it. So we can use a majority of different functions. We could, of course, blend them together if we wanted to. So if we went to edit function, I'm going to change this back to a Perlin noise gradient. And of course, we could use our splitter if we wanted to. We can go down to the bottom, use our combiner, go in and add another fractal node, and then link those together. And we could, of course, blend those to create a different type of fractal node or a different type of function. But what we also have the ability to do, and I'm going to go ahead and delete everything so we're back at the starting point. I'm going to click OK, click populate, so we're at 90%, and we can see that we're pretty much where we started, and before we actually started adding the functions. What we also have the ability to do is do this completely manually, and that means we can go into a paint program and actually create a map which we can map our density to. And I've created a few grayscale maps which are in the content folder on the DVD, and you could load those in. And first I'm going to go to edit function. So we bring our function editor back up, and now we want to add a texture map node, which is this second one in the third group. And we want to make sure density is selected, so that actually adds it in there. Or you could select an invisible area, add it, and then link it if you wanted to. I'm going to select our UV coordinates, which is this little shield looking thing right here, and we're going to set our mapping mode to flat vertical, which is typically what you'd be using for terrains because it is all on the z-axis, up and down, just projecting directly onto that terrain from above. So we're going to be using the flat vertical mapping mode. And now if we take a look at our image, we can actually click this little arrow down here, and it's going to bring up our kind of chooser for all our different surfaces that we have. Now, you may not have anything in here at all, maybe just what came with it, and we could even use some of these that are available, black and white. Even the color will convert to a grayscale once you're using it. But I've created a collection for some of these simple little grayscale maps I've created just for the tutorial. And if you want to create a collection, you just go to this first little button down here and click New Collection. Then it's going to ask you to browse a directory. And once you've set your directory, anything you add into that directory is automatically going to show up in that folder. So I have a grayscale folder on my desktop. If I went into Photoshop right now, or Painter, or used anything that I can create those maps with, and saved it within this folder, it would automatically update in View. So we could close this out, reopen it, and then those new photos, or the new picture files, will be available within View. And I'm going to select this first grayscale map we have right here, which is a nice little gradient that starts from black and works its all the way around in a clockwise fashion all the way to white. And I'm going to click OK. And we don't need to set anything after that because our UV map is already selected and it's covering the entire surface. And I'm going to click OK. Now if I set our function scale back to 1, and I got to get back to our material editor, exit out of that, go back to our material, which we need to, here we go, and we want to set these, and keep in mind, don't hit enter, which I keep hitting enter, and just hit 1, and now we're back to our standard scale, and I'm going to hit populate. And now if we take a look at our actual terrain we have here, and our ecosystem that's on it, and mostly if you take a look at our preview, we can see that we have the densest on where the white area is, and it works its way all the way around to the black. And note that this is not changing the size, just the density. So the density map is just specifically for our density. Our trees will not get smaller in these less dense areas. Okay, and actually if we take a look at maybe another one, just so you can kind of get a better idea of what this does, go back to edit function, and I'm going to load in one of our other maps we have in here. I'm going to load in the second one, which is a nice gradient, sort of a sphere gradient, where it's white in the center and goes to a black, and then we also have a black strip going through the center. I'm going to select that, click OK again, and now repopulate. And now you can notice the change that we have, where we have trees all in the white area, very dense, and then it works its way all the way out to that black area, where it's less dense, and we have a lot more spacing in between our trees up until it gets to the point where there are no trees at all. And that pretty much covers our density. We can use the function editor, we can use the fractal nodes, noise nodes, anything in there, or we can use our image maps. And our image maps can also be used for scaling and orientation. So I'm going to check off our variable density right now and click populate, and now we're kind of back to where we were before. And we're having a little bit of a preview problem. If you can see that we're not actually showing up our full amount of trees. If you really look at our preview, you can see that. And we're going to click on the Scaling and Orientation tab. Now, our overall scaling acts just like density does, where we can adjust the overall scale of everything. And it's preset to the default is 1, which is these small trees right here. But of course, if we drag it up larger, our trees will become very large, and bring it smaller, they'll become very small. And now we're going to select variable scaling. And when you activate variable scaling, you get two filters, variance and size, which you can use to edit our function. So we're going to edit function, and we're going to be doing the exact same thing in the function editor that we did with our density map. And if you notice too, our density map is still saved, even though we've actually deselected it in our material editor. That doesn't destroy any of our function that we had, or any of our settings that we had before. It just kind of temporarily turns it off, but it's still made available. So if you want to turn it back on, you don't have to reset everything. Now by default, our scaling is set to a constant node, which we want to delete, or you can replace that. But I'm going to select scaling, and we are going to add another texture map node. And now with this, we also have our UV coordinates, which I'm going to set to flat vertical, as we did before. And now we are going to use the exact same gradient that we were just using before, the spherical one, and click OK. And now if I populate, and we can still see in the preview, both this preview and the preview on the side in our camera view, that we have very small trees down here to black, and very large trees towards the center. So we're controlling the scale of these trees with that map. And like I said, we can adjust our overall scaling. If we bring it up just a little bit larger and hit populate, now we have much larger trees, and getting to the point where it still gets very, very small. Now, don't think that just because you're using one of these, you can't use a map on another part. If we use density, we could still use our variable density and hit populate. And because it's the same map, we're not going to notice as much of a change because of our size, things like that. They are more spread out now, our trees, now that we have our variable density map on. But let's try turning on something else. If we go to edit function, we're going to change our density map to that first one we used, our clockwise gradient, and click OK. And now repopulate. We're going to notice that we have our same setup that we had before, and we can really see the size. But of course, it's a lot less dense over here than it is up here, and we still have that kind of clockwork fashion going around, and a lot more spread out up here and is down here, and you can really see that. So you can combine the different nodes together and really use the functions side by side to create some pretty neat effects. I'm going to check off our variable density right now, and we're going to try a different scaling option. We'll change our scaling to that first little gradient we had right there, so you can see that. And click OK, and now populate, and now we can see our size has changed where we have very small, and then it works all the way around where we get larger and larger trees. So it's a great way to control the sizing as well as anything else with these grayscale maps if you can create them. If you don't have a program to create them, or if you need a little help as far as a reference, you can actually use your terrain editor. If we double click on the terrain editor, we can actually export our existing terrain as a bump map image, or several different image map files. We also have a Photoshop file and GIFs and things like that. I typically use the bitmap because it preserves everything as non-compressed. I'm going to close that out, but we can actually export this image, which is going to export as a black and white grayscale image, which we could use that to set our density, which would give us a nice altitude, or we could set the amount of density for altitude if we don't want to use the actual material editor for that, or we could use it as a reference within a paint program to paint on that terrain on a different layer, and then we can use it as a really good reference. But the only problem is you cannot do that with a procedural terrain. Procedural terrains cannot be exported because of our high number, and you even cannot export them as image maps. So what you will have to do if you want to use a map from the terrain editor to kind of use as a reference, what I would suggest doing is saving your file first, and then saving as a new file, and then go ahead and convert all your terrains to standard terrains, which you can do if this is a procedural terrain. We can just go up here and select standard. Same thing, if we have a standard, we can just turn it into a procedural by clicking procedural. And if we change this to a standard, then we can go ahead and export that, and we'll get a nice, pretty close version of what we have as a procedural terrain, and then we can use that to work with it in our paint editor. Same thing if we want to actually use it as a map. I'm going to close that out. And actually, I have one of those set up right now. So if we edit our function, I've already saved one of our maps from one of our terrains, and we can see that terrain right here. And click OK and populate. And now this map was entirely created in View. And we have a nice scaling where the black areas, of course, are the smallest amount, or nothing at all, and the white areas are the largest trees. So you can also create custom maps within your texture or terrain editor. And you could even paint them if you wanted to, paint a terrain specifically for a map. So there's lots of different things you can do with it, and lots of ways to control your ecosystems. And we're going to move around here, and I want to actually turn off scaling right now, and we're going to take a look at color. Now, unfortunately, we cannot control color with image maps. It might just be a bug in View right now, and hopefully in the future they'll have that fixed and we'll be able to do that. But right now we're not able to actually use those image maps to control the color. If I check on variable color, then you'll notice that we have a filter, and we also have a color map below. So we can edit that color map, which we could make into a gradient, which I will right now. And actually, I'll do a red, and then I'm going to click in the front, click New Keyframe, and I'm going to make that blue. Now the way to control this gradient is within our function editor, just like we can control everything else, except now we have to use fractal nodes, or noise nodes, but we cannot use a texture map because it will not work. So we're going to add in that simple fractal, and I want to make some changes to it, up the gain, and make it just a little bit smaller, so we'll be really able to see those variations that are going to come about from it. Click OK, and now hit populate. And now we have our terrain. Since our density and scaling maps are off, we have a even density of 90% across the terrain, and we have our color map, the red and the blue, distributed across these trees. So our overall color of our trees is changing. And if you notice too, we have our color correction, which is overall color, which has become purple. Which what it's doing is pretty much blending these colors together and taking from the center. And that way we get our purple that we can use as our overall color. But this is a good way to control color as well. So if we wanted different variations, maybe make it a little more realistic, we could size it up a bit, maybe bring our gain down so it's not such a high contrast. Click OK, repopulate, and we'll just take a look at that before we actually go ahead and change it. And as you can see, it's very purple right now, but we do get spots of red and spots of blue in there. Let's go and change our color map. We're going to change this to that kind of dark green we had before. And then also on the other side, we want to do about the same thing, maybe a little bit lighter, and click OK, and OK again, and now populate. And we'll notice that our trees are changing, where we have light parts and dark trees, and we can just change the colors that way. And like I said, this works with anything. You don't need to necessarily do this with plants. We could easily do the same exact thing with rocks. So if I go and remove our plant, and we add in rocks, and I'm going to click yes because I want some different colors on there, and click populate. Now we have a nice distribution of rocks on there, and we have a variable color, which is already mapped onto there in our function editor. So this is actually already mapping our color onto there, but we could change that if we wanted to. We could edit our color map so that instead of this was green instead of a brown, and we can populate that and edit these rocks so that we get sort of a green and tan color. So we could edit those rocks as well. We could also adjust our scaling and hit populate by using the same node that we had before for our scaling. So now we have a little neat variation of these rocks. I'm going to zoom in here and we'll really take a look. We can see we have very large rocks with small rocks around them, and that's a lot more realistic look, and that's something you'd actually see in real life. And instead of just giant boulders everywhere, you'd have little bits of fragments here and there if you saw boulders laying around. And like I said, we can also use our density. So if I turn off our scaling, turn our density back on, and hit populate, now we have our density map affecting our rocks, where we have very few, and then also sweeping its way around. And we can also adjust our scaling with another map that we had in there. So I'm going to click Edit Function, and I'm going to load in this other one where we have a nice gradient from black to white, bottom to top, and then just a white line going through to show that we have the most amount, which will give us kind of a neat effect. And I'll populate. And now, since we're adjusting our scaling, we're going to notice something a little bit different. And where we have this line right here, since rocks are set up a little different than trees, but we can still notice that we have very large rocks where that line was kind of flowing through. And then we also have very tiny rocks down here, flowing all the way up to the top, but our density map is still effective. At least it should be. Yes, it is. So you can even see right there that it is, because we have low distribution of our rocks over here, blending all the way to the side. So there's lots of different stuff you can do with it. And like I said, we can also do this with objects. So if I remove this object, and we're going to add in an object, we can use any of the preset objects that come with Vue, or anything you import from another software program. So if you're using Lightwave, or Maya, or 3D Studio Max, Softimage, anything like that, you can create UV maps so that the materials transfer over. But you can bring in your objects and use those as ecosystems as well. And if any of you remember the sort of the promotional video for Vue, and maybe you saw the city that was created with the ships flying through it. Well, those ships were, or those actual buildings were created, imported into Vue, and an ecosystem was created from them, so you can make a giant city. So there's lots of stuff you can do with it. We're going to take just this yacht right now, and we'll load that in, and I'm going to scale that down to about 0.2 and hit populate. And now we're going to notice the exact same thing we have with the rocks, but with this object. So this works with any part of ecosystem creation. We have very small boats in here, and then lots of large ones. And we could also change, of course, their orientation, so they're not all facing the same direction if we didn't want to. We can make them non-uniform depending on proportions. And we could also change their rotation, so we can change the rotation down to 0, hit populate, and now if you notice, they're all facing the same direction, or some of them are going off to the side a bit. And we also have them stacked on each other, and that's kind of just a preview error. But all these changes still affect our ecosystem, which most of them are covered in the Getting Started video, so I'm not going to get into them too much. But we have the ability to just use these actual maps in the function editor and change both color, scaling orientation, and density.